Morning, everyone. The four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they each tell the story of the resurrection on that first Easter Sunday morning. There are parts of the stories that are the same, but they each tell them a little bit differently. They each have their own emphasis and their own focus. I love to preach on John's version of the resurrection, that moment in the garden when Jesus calls Mary's name. The version that makes me the most uncomfortable comes from Mark's Gospel. The way that Mark tells the story is the hardest to read, I find, because it's so unresolved. It's so unfinished. The story, and in fact the earliest versions of Mark's Gospel as a whole, end with the line, "Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." And it ends. What kind of an ending is that? It's a bit like the last episode of a Netflix series. It leaves you wondering, well, what just happened? Or perhaps a movie that ends before you're ready for it to end, and you sit there thinking, what exactly does that mean? And that is the question that we must ask of the resurrection. What does this mean? We know how the story ends for those first followers of Jesus because the other Gospels do tell us. The woman did tell people. Jesus did show himself to others. He did rise from the dead, and it is good news because here we are, 2,000 years later, still celebrating it. But even still, we need to come back to that question. How does the story end for us? For you and for me here today, what does this mean? Well, it means that we also have a story to tell. Those first disciples were not anybody particularly special. They were very ordinary people who had encountered Jesus. And those women who went to the tomb that day, they didn't go expecting to find a man raised from the dead. They went with the very practical task of preparing the body of somebody that they loved for burial. And when they saw the stone rolled away and the angel sitting there, they didn't know what was going on. None of it made any sense to them. They were confused and they were bewildered and they didn't know what to do. And yet, they are still part of the story. And their lives have become part of God's big picture. In that moment, they had no idea what it would all mean, but they let it become part of God's story, and it has become more than they could ever possibly imagine. Because that is what God does. It is what God did with those first women who were uncertain and confused and thought that life was completely derailed. And it is what God will do with you and with me, because we also have a story to tell. That is what the angel said to those women. He said, "Come and see where his body was laid, and now go and tell. Go and share a story of good news of what God has done. He brings life and hope and something new in those places we least expect it." What it means is that we also stand before an empty tomb, and it means we also have a story to tell. And it means that our lives are the way we tell that story. The way that we choose to live in response to what God has done is how we tell the story. One of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, says it like this. She says, "What will you do with your one wild, precious life? What is the story your life will tell?" The version of Jesus' resurrection that we read in Mark's Gospel doesn't have an ending, because the ending is to be continued in you and in me. Our lives are the next episode, the next season of the story of God at work in the world. And those areas of our lives that feel tough, those areas that feel maybe a little bit broken, those areas that don't seem to make sense, or maybe those areas where sin has power over us, those are the areas where Jesus is waiting to invite us into life, to bring life in a new way. Your life gets to be part of God's bigger story. And because of Easter, the story that our lives tell is one of hope. It's a story that says there is nothing that can ever separate us from the love of God that is ours in Jesus Christ. It's a story that says there is nothing that can put us beyond the reach of God's love. No grief, no loneliness, no sin, not even death can separate us from God's love. Because on Easter, love has won. So because of Jesus, love meets us outside of an empty tomb today. And the story in us is to be continued, a story of love. Amen.